I'd like us to think about that passage this morning. We're concluding what has been a series on the life of Hezekiah that we've been doing on and off for the last couple of months. Good King Hezekiah, as we've been calling him. Over that series, we've seen how the king had the courage to be different, how during his reign he challenged what was wrong. We've seen how he made it possible for not only the people in his kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, to worship God in Jerusalem, but he also made it possible for people in the northern kingdom of Israel to worship God in Jerusalem. We've seen in this series how he's faced many struggles that have affected and impacted on the nation. And also most recently, we focused on the struggles they had that were very personal, that impacted on his own life. And our passage this morning from 2 Chronicles 32 is really the chronicler giving a summary of his life, summarizing all of that. And it reminds us of just how active God has been in his life. It reminds us of the event that we looked at just a couple of weeks ago when Hezekiah was so ill. He was terminally ill, and yet God had healed him. And God at that point had also given him a sign that he was healing and that he could trust his promise in that the shadow from the sun went backwards. A remarkable sign. In this summary, we're told about how Hezekiah had acquired great wealth, huge flocks, great herds, how he created treasuries and storehouses. And we could think, well, that's all personal wealth. But of course, he was the king. It was more than that. The whole people, the nation benefited from the prosperity that had taken place in the time of Hezekiah's reign. God had certainly blessed him and them as a people. And it also talks about his engineering accomplishments. It talks about diverting the waters of a spring into the city. Just to explain that, as many people probably know, most of Jerusalem is up on a hill. But to the west of the city, there's low-lying land. And that land is lower than a nearby spring. So what they did in Hezekiah's time is they built a watercourse to take the water from the spring into the low-level land, and then they extended the wall of the city around the reservoir that were created. So basically, they created a reservoir within the city wall. Now, strategically, that's a good thing to have, of course. In the event of a siege, it guarantees they've got a supply of fresh water within the city. Now, there are some people who say, oh, wasn't that a lack of trust on Hezekiah's part? Surely if he believed that God would protect Jerusalem, he wouldn't have done that. He'd have just left it to God to protect it. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's to be seen as part of God's provision for them. God was going to protect the city, and he enabled them to defend it and to make it ready for a siege. Just in the same way as building storehouses for grain and so on protects against fluctuations in harvest. It's a sensible thing to do. And if we think back, remember when we looked at Hezekiah's terminal illness, remember how God used the medicines of the day to make him well. This is the same. God had used the technology available to enable them to make the city defensible. It was part of God's great provision. But what we do see in this passage very clearly is that later on in his life, Hezekiah, good King Hezekiah, failed. He failed in his old age. And that's what I'd like us to focus on this morning. Because let's face it, all of us one day will enter old age. And this great and godly man failed in his old age. What I'd like us to focus on this morning is what for any of us could really be the danger that we face in old age. What was his failing? Simply that he became proud. Hezekiah became proud. He'd forgotten God's role in all of the ways in which God had blessed him. All of the things that happened in his life, he seemed to have forgotten God's part in that. And what we see in this passage is that the king of Babylon, who had heard that Hezekiah had been terminally ill, but then had recovered, and that God had given this remarkable sign of the sun going backwards, sent ambassadors to inquire of that. The fuller story is given in 2 Kings chapter 20. So these ambassadors came to visit Hezekiah. They brought a letter of good wishes and congratulations almost from the king of Babylon to Hezekiah. And what we're told is that Hezekiah received them well, and he showed them everything he had in his kingdom. He took them into the palace and into the temple, and he showed them around. He showed them everything that he had. We could ask, well, what's wrong with that? Here these people come with goodwill, and he's taken them and he's shown them the city, and he's shown them all the prosperity and everything that God has blessed him with. What's wrong with that? Well, I think to answer that question, we've got to understand the context. The northern kingdom of Israel, as we've mentioned before, had already been occupied by the Assyrians. The king of Assyria had invaded and taken the northern kingdom. Assyria was the dominant power in the region. They were the threat to everybody. They were the military threat to Judah, Hezekiah's kingdom in southern Israel, and they were the dominant threat to the Babylonians. So it's probably helpful to think about this visit of the ambassadors as rather like almost like a summit, but obviously they're not the heads of state because the king of Babylon hadn't come. He'd send ambassadors, but that sort of thing, a preparation for almost like a treaty. It's like forming of NATO almost. Can we make an alliance that would help us defend against this common threat that is facing us all? That's really the sort of context. And it's in that sort of situation that Hezekiah took these in, and he was keen to show off all that he had. He was basically saying, look what we've got. Look what we can do. Look what we can achieve. Look what we can contribute, if you like, to this defensive pact. The emphasis on look what we have, we can do, we can contribute. What he didn't do is talk about God. Talk about how God had brought this about. Talk about how God had made this possible. Now, as a result of what he did, those ambassadors would have gone back to Babylon and said, yeah, if we want to defend against the king of Assyria, we want what those people have got. We want sort of these people, we want to take them into ourselves. We want them. Think how different it would have been if Hezekiah had said, our God's defended us in the past. Our God has always provided for us. Those ambassadors would not have gone back to Babylon with the same story. They would have gone back saying, we don't want what they've got. We don't want those people. What we want is their God. But Hezekiah hadn't. He'd forgotten God's part. There's a really interesting verse in Isaiah 22. It's an earlier prophecy of Isaiah about the city of Jerusalem. And what it says is this: between the city walls, you built a reservoir for water from the old pool, but you never asked help from the one who did all this. You never considered the one who planned it long ago. That was Hezekiah's failing. He forgot God. He forgot God's part in all of the ways that he blessed him through his life. In that fuller account that's given to us in 2 Kings chapter 20, what we're told is, having shown these ambassadors from Babylon everything that he had, Isaiah went to him and said, look, who were these men? What did you show them? And Hezekiah said, well, I showed them everything. I've shown them everything in the kingdom. And Isaiah said the word from God, the word of prophecy. He said, the Babylonians will come and they will take everything you've shown them. They will invade this city, they will take this city, and they will take away everything you'd shown them. And of course, that's what later on happened after Hezekiah's lifetime. Jerusalem was occupied by the Babylonians. All of the treasures of the temple and the palace were taken off to Babylon, as were the people of the land. They were taken into captivity. Hezekiah, in his old age, had forgotten God. And as a consequence, all that he'd achieved, all of his blessings, everything that was seen in his life went to waste because of his failure in old age. Surely, for all of us, this passage this morning is a warning, because we will all face old age. And it's so easy in that for pride to take over. Think how easy it is for a minister like myself to be able to look back on our career and say to people, look what I've done. Forgetting to mention God. It's easy for any of us to say, look what we've achieved, look what we've gathered, look what we've done in life, and to forget God's part in it. It's so easy to be focused on the blessing that we forget the one who blessed. And if we do that, what will be the outcome? Think of the people that we will encounter, that we will meet in old age. They'll hear the story of what we've done, what we've achieved, what we've got, and they'll go away thinking, that's what we want. We'll work to get that. We'll strive to achieve this, and they'll know nothing of God. Whereas if we remain faithful, if we can look back on our lives and say, that's where God blessed, that's how God provided, then those we encounter will go away thinking, I want their God.